here's the title of my talk. It's really mostly about trees and evolution. There's a teeny bit of paleontology. There's really one big thing that I want to convey to you in the next 30 minutes, and that is, what can a tree tell us about history, and how do we know it's true? And a biologist who uses a tree in this sense is no different than a historian, a social scientist. It's not a disciplinarily unique metaphor or tool. And the other thing I'll sort of finish with is a few parallels in linguistics. It's to me then to define phylogenetics, and I would do that very simply by saying this is the science of reconstructing, in a biological sense, the tree of life. And this, of course, is oriented today around this theory of descent with modification, a very specific theory of process that Charles Darwin came up with in 1859. And indeed, not only am I saying the name Charles Darwin, but I'm also showing you this famous picture that I think everyone recognizes. It's not from The Origin of Species. This is from one of his notebooks in the 1830s. This is really the first application of a tree metaphor in biology. One of the first. What it means is that the tips here represent species, usually ones that are alive today. So that could be a human, that could be a chimp, that could be a gorilla, these could be 3 kinds of beetles, these could be 3 kinds of plants. Species that are alive today, the lines that connect them represent an actual lineage of generational descent. As a historian, speaking as a historian in the broad sense, these lines represent something that actually happened. Lines of genealogical continuity that join some animals together to the exclusion of others. And the reason he would draw a tree like this, and he didn't be very specific as you see, he just put letters on it, but we'll see trees that are more specific, that have chimps and humans together, for example. The reason you pick a chimp and a gorilla, or a chimp and a human, or a salmon and a trout, and not other animals, is you have different lines of evidence. You have biogeography. I think all of you recognize this Google Maps image of the Galapagos. You have the fossil record. You have stratigraphy. It's not random the order you find certain fossils in the geological record. Today, of course, we have a line of evidence that was not known at all to biologists, to historians in the 19th century, and that's, of course, the double helical nature of the DNA molecule. We have comparative embryology, which of course is another line of evidence that was known in the 19th century. This is not exhaustive. These are just a few major lines of evidence with which you could draw a tree, like that one. A very important dichotomy I'd like to articulate that's related to trees and the evidence that you use to make a tree is here, process and pattern. So within a process, you have a specific idea of a historical mechanism that is active, that explains something about history. And so 2 competing ideas about process. Here I'm going to engage more in hero worship. So Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, he died in about 1830, if I'm not mistaken, so he overlapped with Charles Darwin by about 20 years. Darwin was born in 1809. And he was the master of biology in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And he had a theory of process, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which has some things in common with descent with modification, with the Darwinian process. So a blacksmith spends hours every day banging a hammer on an anvil. And the inheritance of acquired characteristics says that the blacksmith's son will have big muscles, because the activity, the adaptation of the parent is somehow communicated directly to the offspring. You see, of course, the rather profound difference with the Darwinian mechanism. There is certainly continuity of adaptations from one generation to the next, but it is not directly influenced by the giraffe reaching up to the tall parts of the tree to find a leaf. That activity per se does not somehow find its way into the eggs or sperm of any given giraffe. Anyways, these are 2 different theories of process that operated in history, and this is what we want to find out. Can we say anything about Darwin versus Lamarck when we look at, now here's the other side of my dichotomy, the patterns. And broadly speaking, I would define pattern as distribution and nature of data, and you can summarize evidence, you can summarize pattern by drawing a tree. And I'm going to get back to this use of what a process says about pattern, in particular trees, that might enable you to pick what process is really responsible for some historical pattern. Biologists have been drawing trees for a long time. Sometimes it was very explicit, such as Ernst Haeckel. I think this first showed up in his German language publication in the 1870s. And most of this tree is composed of vertebrates. You have some arthropods here and some worms and mollusks and other sorts of things. But this is sort of a literal tree of life. And it's saying very specific things about who's related to whom. And it's telling us something about the patterns of genealogical continuity that some animals share to the exclusion of others. Thomas Henry Huxley, he didn't actually draw trees, but if you read what Huxley wrote, for example, in this book in 1863, he's making very specific statements about who resembles whom based on development. So Huxley had a nice developmental series of snakes and lizards, and he says that these two animals are a lot more like each other in terms of their development than either is to a cat. And humans and chimps have a lot more in common with each other than either does to a turtle or an iguana or a guppy. And so if you were to take that text that I just showed you and build a modern-looking tree, it would look something like that. So you got your humans and chimps together, your cats and dogs, your mammals together to the exclusion of non-mammals. And all that Huxley is doing is taking the patterns that he sees, in particular these lovely images of various embryos. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell that that embryo looks quite a bit like this elephant shrew embryo, and both of them look a lot like this chick embryo. The point being, of course, something that was obvious to embryologists for decades before Darwin came around or wrote anything. These guys look a lot more like each other than do their adult forms. And the longer you look at these developmental series, the more precise you can be about who resembles whom. And that's what led Huxley to say, for example, cats and dogs are together. Now, one of the things that even professional biologists don't often fully appreciate is the vast number of different ways that you could draw a tree with 10 species connected to it. So here's the formula. If you replace that n with the number of terminals, in this case 10, and you calculate the number, it's 34,459,425. There are over 34 million different rooted bifurcating trees that you can use to illustrate interrelationships for these 10 species. So he could have got this really wrong, at least using a standard of correctness, of truth, that I'll come back to in a moment. He could have drawn this in a lot of different ways. Let's take another example of a 19th century tree. This time it's by a fellow named Theodore Gill. He wrote a book on fishes, and his name is Gill. I think that was a pure accident. In 1872, this was not my inference of what Gill was writing. Rather, it's, as you can see, this is a scan of the actual book. And it's clearly a tree. A lot of these terms won't necessarily be obvious. This here is a branchiostoma, the lancelet, the little thing you can find in various lakes and rivers in Scotland. And it's basically a teeny little fishy-like thing with what appears to be segmentation in vertebrae, but it doesn't have a head. It's a lancelet, branchiostoma. And he puts that at the base of our vertebrate tree. Here he has near relative to a larger clade that consists of jawed fish. And of course, jawed fish in turn entails our cartilaginous fish, our skates, rays, and sharks. Here we have our bony fish consisting of our ray fins, things like tuna and gars and whatever it was you had for lunch yesterday, because I think lungfish and coelacanths are usually on the menu. And then, of course, sister taxon to the ray fin fish are our lobe-fin fish. Like I said, your coelacanth, your lungfish, and of course your amphibians, your reptiles, your mammals, your birds. So that's quite profound what Gill was doing in 1872. He's saying that a coelacanth, which you had never seen one of these things before, and you look at it at a distance, it looks like a fish. It's completely aquatic, it has gills, it has fins, and you might be tempted to put it in here with your tuna or your sturgeons or something, but Gill didn't. Gill put it in with his lobe-fin fish, saying that a lungfish or a coelacanth was closer to you and I than it was to any of these fully aquatic ray-fin fish. The other point to make here is that the tree that Gill shows us is bigger than the one that I inferred from Huxley. Instead of 10, he has 18 species. And if you replace n with 18, this is the number that you get. That's about, I think it's quintillion. So there are many other ways, to say the least, that you could draw a tree with 18 tips on it. He could have really done something drastically different. But he didn't. He picked this one, this particular tree. And of course, today we have one of the several areas of evidence about which Gill and Huxley and Darwin and Haeckel and all these 19th century people knew nothing. We know a lot about. Here's a very idealized picture of an animal cell. You have a nucleus, and inside that nucleus you have the vast majority of genetic information. There are these little organelles also inside the cell, each of which has its own complement of genetic information. And so here's a very small mitochondrial genome. Here's the chromosomes in a human. In a human, we have 3.6-ish billion nucleotides. This is a source of data that you can use to test these statements by Gill and Huxley Is a lungfish really closer to a frog and to you and I than it is to a salmon or a trout? Or is a chimp really close to a human being, more so than it is to an opossum? And of course, when you do this, you find that these guys in the 19th century were spot on, using a completely different source of data, using a completely different part of the pattern left behind by nature, by this historical process. They come up with a tree diagram that's very similar. So it just so happens that there's a really great book out there called Evolution and Belief, and I wrote it. And in chapter 9, I have a figure and a table that gives you step-by-step instruction about how to go to this website and download genetic data. You have more access to information at your fingertips than every naturalist from Aristotle to Linus Pauling put together. And you can use your access to that information to test these ideas about who's related to whom. And you come up with trees like this. This is just cytochrome B. That happens to be the one I used in the chapter as an example. Very simple, very short. The point I want to make is that these basic groups, placental mammals to the exclusion of a marsupial, or archosaurs to the exclusion of squamates, all of these things were not invented post-PCR. The vast majority of statements about the identity of orders and kingdoms and phyla and classes were all pre-DNA, basically, or pre-discovery of the double helix, certainly pre-elaboration of lab methods that enabled you to do that. And molecular biology has confirmed the basic structure of the vertebrate tree of life as proposed in the 19th century. Notice I didn't say the bacterial tree of life. That's a much more difficult thing for reasons we'll get into in a moment. And I don't want to say that they're identical. Here's a histogram showing you on the y-axis the number of possible trees you could get, and on the x-axis the extent to which a given tree is optimal or not. Say, for example, using parsimony, which is one of many different optimality criteria. You can use likelihood, you can use various Bayesian algorithms. Consider, if you will, for a moment, a single tree being the size of a grain of sand. And if you stack up all the suboptimal trees here, here's the Empire State Building as a reference. There are lots and lots of suboptimal trees. Here's this great big part of the histogram where you find all these suboptimal trees. The ones that were proposed in the 19th century regarding vertebrates, Gill, Haeckel, Huxley et al., in terms of their optimality, are very, very close to the ones supported by mitogenomics, by genomics. And so, again, molecular biology has confirmed the basic structure of the vertebrate tree, and that's telling us something about history. That's telling us at least the extent to which the process of Darwinian descent with modification predicts that these different sources of data should converge, and they do, at least in the grand scheme of things. So, different processes in biology make competing demands on the patterns of data that should be left behind. And I want now to spend just a couple minutes to try and convince you that I have just given you some data with which to favor a Darwinian mechanism over a Lamarckian mechanism based on these tree diagrams. So I'm interested to a great extent in the biology and evolutionary history of these endemic African mammals. These guys, the so-called dune shark that you find in southern Namibia, northwestern South Africa, Erymetalpa grantii, Grant's golden mole, and in a collaborative project, I and some colleagues sequenced a very small part of this animal's nuclear genome, just one part of one exon of one coding gene, and it's all publicly available on that same website I mentioned a minute ago. And you can use these data to put a golden mole, Erymetalpa, in the tree of mammalian life. And where this golden mole ends up is within this clade known as Afrotheria. You don't have to worry about Afrotheria, but what I want to convince you of is that this golden mole has a closer evolutionary history shared with the African and Indian elephant, among other mammals. These two animals are more closely related to each other than this animal is to a talpid mole. If Lamarck's process were correct, you would expect the adaptation to be driving the patterns of genealogy. What you actually see is that animals with very different adaptations, a whale and a human being, for example, a whale and a human being are unequivocally closer related to each other than either is to a tuna, despite the fact that obviously in terms of their adaptations, the whale and the tuna are much closer to one another. So this, I would submit to you, as an example of using a tree to choose between two different processes, Lamarckian versus Darwinian. And in this particular case, the Darwinian one wins. The teeny little bit of paleontology that I'm going to sneak in here is another source of data that you can use as a basis for inferring pattern to inform your trees. And that's by using the stratigraphic record. Here's a picture of some part of the world. You can see the lovely pages of Earth history laying out before you, telling you what happened below was older than what happened above. Pointing out to you here a tree of all living animals. Chimps and humans, monkey, dogs, you got some primates, you got some mammals there. And without knowing anything about geology, simply by having that tree, you should be able to say things, or you are able to say things like, if this tree is true, then the common ancestor of all mammals there should be found in a younger part of the geological record than, say, the common ancestor of all, say, tetrapods. And that's exactly what you find in the fossil record. The oldest vertebrate is much, much older than the oldest amniote. The oldest amniote is much, much older than the oldest mammal. The oldest mammal is much, much older than the oldest primate. You get the point. Now, in this particular case, there's nothing about the two processes that distinguish each other sufficiently to be able to use a stratigraphic record to distinguish between a Lamarckian process and a Darwinian one. It does support both of them insofar as they are consistent with common ancestry, but the Lamarckian process and the Darwinian one don't make mutually exclusive predictions about who should show up where in the stratigraphic record. That's my biology part of the talk, the long, weighty bit. Now I want to suggest some parallels with linguistics. So trees and linguistics. I think in many ways you can do very similar things in linguistics and in biology. One is articulate some ideas about process and view evidence, data, as patterns, and you can use those data to build trees. Actually, linguists started using trees in the 18th century, long before biologists were doing this, which is actually quite interesting. And now it seems to be the reverse, but historically speaking, the linguists were there first. Here are two different processes in linguistic evolution that I pretty much just made up yesterday, and I'd be happy to be corrected. You can consider in situ evolution of a language. I'm going to focus on English, and this is the very intuitive observation that younger generations tend to say things slightly differently than their parents. So if you're a fan of Leonard Bernstein, you've seen West Side Story, you might have heard the phrase daddy-o. I guess people said that in the 50s. That's sort of the 50s equivalent of dude. And then in the 60s, you had things like groovy and man, and you don't really say that in the U.S. anymore, at least. Sometimes you get retro fads and people resurrect these older ways. And then starting in the 90s, after The Big Lebowski, which I'm sure all of you have seen, people started saying dude. So this is all in situ evolution of a language. And of course, another process has to do with immigrant groups that come to a certain place and just mix whatever it was they were speaking where they came from with their new home. Or they go to the movies, Arnold Schwarzenegger, he comes up with things like hasta la vista, baby, which is clearly an example of a migrational event in linguistic evolution. Anyone who's seen The Lion King knows what Hakuna Matata means, even though if you've never been to East Africa. And there's also an interesting example in English. Those of you who are familiar with the Midwest, Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, there's a heavily Scandinavian/Germanic influence linguistically in that part of the world. What you may hear in the Midwest, and you won't hear in Boston or Philly or DC, is the sentence, "You want to come with?" In Boston, you expect something to come after that with part, because it's such a heavily Germanized, it's all those Lutherans from Norway and Schleswig-Holstein that emigrated there 150 years ago. People ask, "You want to come with?" And so this is a migrational language as well. So you can take a tree of linguistics, and you all don't need me to tell you that English, US versions, UK versions, it's a Germanic language. We know a lot about the history that confirms this. You use the morphology and the syntax of that language to make these decisions about where we put English as a language. There's something that English does that immediately identifies it as a Germanic language and not, say, a Romance language. If you just look at the vocabulary, words like serve, beef, there's tons of French vocabulary in English. Modifying a verb with a preposition. I look the word up. I watch out for my friend. Italian doesn't do that. French doesn't do that. Schaust du zu, machst du mit? Modifying the verb as a preposition is a very Germanic thing. And that's how you know, one of the reasons why you know that English is here with the other Germanic languages. You also have sort of a fossil record in linguistic evolution. And so here's a 9th century bit of text from the court of King Alfred. Read it. It doesn't really make sense for German or English speakers. But when you translate it directly into German, aber ihm hatten Karthager den Weg verlegt. That's a reasonable sentence in German. Carthage doesn't exist anymore, but grammatically speaking, that's a reasonable sentence. And that's a word-for-word translation of what the Old English says. Whereas the modern English, if you translate that word for word, but to him had Carthaginians the road blocked, you kind of know what it means, but it sounds off. No one would ever say something like that. So this is a fossil consistent with this branching pattern here that puts English, as it has evolved in situ in the British Isles, as a Germanic language. What I've not told you about is the lateral transfer that happens rampantly. And here's a German example. Those of you who have lived in Berlin, hey Alter, hast du iPod bei? Kannst du rüberbeamen meine Songs? This means, hey dude, you have an iPod, not to be confused with the thing where you crack your hard-boiled egg. Can you send me your songs? So this is clearly somehow Turkish grammar and pronunciation with an English word and just all mixed up into one thing. And this is lateral transfer. It's very similar to what bacteria do genetically. It makes life much more difficult if you want to reconstruct a tree. So in this case, we have two processes that I've articulated: in situ generational variation, one generation comes up with new words, or migrational transfer. Can you really use trees in this case to tease apart what's happening? In this particular case, you can't really distinguish between these two things, using trees at least. So this is unlike the example about the patterns enabling you to distinguish between Lamarckian evolution and Darwinian evolution. So there's a lovely article that Marcelo shared with me by Temkin and Eldridge, in which they articulate this serious problem about using trees in a cultural sense. Linguistics, of course, is part of that. And basically the take-home message is that linguistic evolution, among other cultural kinds of evolution, is really noisy. And I got the sense from that article that they were kind of giving up. No, we shouldn't bother. And I want to close my presentation by saying that you should bother, because within the methodology of phylogenetics, at least as developed in biology, we have means of dealing with ambiguity. Thank you very much.